Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Learning Collective. I'm Ann Wynn, Marketing Specialist with Risk Inc., and today I am very excited and honored to have two guests who are ATD Houston chapter members, as well as subject matter experts in their field of learning and development, but also particularly in the topic for today, blended learning. And if you will allow me a couple minutes, I'm going to introduce both Jay and Rhonda for those who are not familiar with them. Jay Clancy is President of Strategic Ascent, a consulting firm that specializes in designing strategic learning programs to improve organizational results. Jay has over 25 years of experience designing and facilitating interpersonal and technical learning programs in a variety of industries globally. Jay has a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology and a Master of Science in training and development. In addition to consulting, he's taught undergraduate courses for UVH, the University of Houston, and has served on the boards of several institutions. Welcome, Jay. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you.
And Rhonda Reeves. Rhonda leads the corporate learning function at NOV, a Houston-based multinational provider of technology and equipment used in oil field and alternative energy applications. She innovates learning interventions with these goals in mind: being relevant, having real-time application, and creating real business impact. After uncovering learning and business needs, Rhonda designed blended learning needs, After uncovering learning and business needs, Rhonda designed blended learning programs as a solution. She speaks and presents webinars on various topics, including learning innovation, blended learning, and overhauling traditional performance management. Welcome, Rhonda.
Thank you very much, Ann. Nice to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you again, both of you, for your time. And I'm looking forward to this discussion about blended learning, just because the concept, after doing some research, the concept has been around for decades, but yet there's still this conversation as though it's this new buzzword, this new thing, this new trend. So could you each share with us what exactly blended learning is? I'll start with you, Rhonda.
Okay, great. Blended learning is a strategic solution, right? It serves a need. So it's not like all of a sudden you should just tell your learning department, go develop blended learning. It needs to be for a reason. And one of the things that you can afford yourself in blended learning is technology, which is great. It doesn't have to include technology, but it can. I always tell people that blended learning, something unique to it is that you must give the learner some control over pace, place, and path. So how fast they go, they need to have some ability to self-direct, which is an adult learning principle. The place that they do it, right now, a lot of people are learning at home, but they can anyway with blended learning. And then also the path. There may be a little bit, there may be some, there may be a lot of places where they can kind of decide which path they want to go. So that's where I always try to make that point first: pace, place, and path, and I'll let Jay fill in the other blanks, because he and I agree.
Yeah, no, that sounds great, Rhonda. I remember 20-something years ago when they first started using the word blended learning, and what blended learning meant back then was some combination of face-to-face and e-learning. And because that was shortly after the computers had been built, and once they built computers and they thought, hey, you know what, we can use that to train people. And then people had this idea that why don't we take all of our face-to-face classes and put them all on e-learning and save all this money. And I think they came to the inevitable conclusion that that doesn't work. So then there was this big pendulum swing back and forth between let's go back to face-to-face and let's go back to e-learning. And then at some point, someone coined this term about blended learning, where they said, well, we can do both. We can do face-to-face and e-learning. Well, I mean, okay, congratulations on them discovering that. But I think, as Rhonda pointed out, it's much more complex than that, right? I mean, blended learning is about recognizing that we have all of this great technology at our fingertips that we can use to create all kinds of learning experiences. And our job as instructional designers is to figure out what the best blend of all of those technologies that are available to us to make sure that we get the best learning experience possible for our participants. And with a recognition that sometimes we don't get to choose the best just because we want it. Sometimes there's business constraints that get in our way. And so blended learning also helps out a lot with that.
Sure. So blended learning is, I'm sorry.
One more distinction too. The point is that a lot of times people think that technological solutions is just e-learning. But besides e-learning, there's online learning, there's virtual learning. They are different things.
Yes.
Yeah,
Totally.
absolutely. That's a great point. And so, and you're right in saying that blended learning, people think it's just this blend of in-person or instructor-led training and some type of online or e-learning, but it's so much more, and you both have shared those points. And I love the 3 Ps, Rhonda. It's easy to remember, right? Place, pace, and path. And so you brought up the topic of technologies. There are technologies now that we could possibly use for blended learning. So what's the best way to go about doing so? And what would be the best technologies? Just because it's there doesn't mean that it should be used. Jay,
well, okay, so obviously the first thing we need to consider is what the learning objectives are, right? We need to make sure we understand what the business needs and the results we're trying to achieve, and then define learning objectives that actually help us achieve those results. And so we choose the technologies that are going to most benefit us with those business results. And that alone is a challenge, because I remember back when people used to say, well, there's some things you can only teach face-to-face, like leadership or interpersonal skills or whatever. Okay. Well, since then, we've been teaching leadership and coaching and interpersonal skills, online for years. So there's lots of different ways to think about how to achieve those objectives. The next thing I think I'd say is we have to look at the learner's needs and what their learning styles are, in the sense that, for example, one of the things that blended or online virtual kind of learning is better for is for introverts who don't like speaking up in class. So and then the third thing I'd say is, like I said earlier, look at the business constraints. We've got clients who it's just not practical to bring people in for a face-to-face course ever. They maybe hire people. They're spread out across, maybe the United States or across the world. So flying people in isn't feasible. And then they may hire people only in 1s and 2s here and there, where it doesn't make any sense to fly people in for a 1-person course. So we have to look for ways to reach them instead of leave them out like the companies traditionally do, because they're too far away to bring in. So a good blend of strategies also helps us include people who are remote.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the first things that we look at in terms of deciding what technology is, one of our strategic objectives for the company is to reduce our working capital. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what assets do we currently have, and I'm going to leverage those. We use Harvard Managed Mentor. We have a couple others that we use, but the main thing that we're going to use for online learning that people can go to, that culturally they've gotten more used to, and so it's not as big of a learning curve for them to get started on it, that's going to be HMM. And then we combine that with other methods as well. But that would be, just like you said, the business constraints. That's my first one. I have to meet those strategic objectives in order to do that. And then we have to meet certain audiences. And so introvert or not, we're gonna deliver in this way. And I think what that leads to is really skilled facilitation in those sessions that you have face-to-face, which we're face-to-face right now. We're not in person, but we're face-to-face. People think, leaders think, oh, it has to be face-to-face. Okay, it is.
That's a great point, though, Rhonda, because you're right. We are face-to-face. We're just face-to-face via electronic means, but this doesn't mean that we couldn't see, I can see your facial expression. I can see your smile. I can read your body language, even though we can't see everything. So that is a really good point. I hadn't thought of it.
Yeah,
that way.
no, that's excellent. Can I tack on to what Rhonda said about, I like what you were mentioning about working capital is a huge thing that people are especially worried about now. Getting our CapEx under control and making sure we have our cash flow working properly. Every company's worried about that. And coming up with the right blended solution can help with that, not only in reducing things like travel costs, but the other thing that we can do is if you do blended learning right, you can reduce your time to competence. And time to competence can pay off not only in a reduced expenses, but also if depending on your business model, reducing time to competence can increase your revenue, and everybody needs more revenue now.
Yes. We're going to talk a little bit down the road about business outcomes, because so often L&D and the C-suite, it seems like, are kind of siloed, and you don't maybe not necessarily always know the business goals to help reach those goals. But we'll get a little down further in the discussion. I'm getting ahead of myself here. I guess one of the more popular trends or concepts right now is the idea of personalized training programs. And you brought this up, Rhonda, where you were saying how a blended learning approach could help us to, whether it's an introvert or an extroverted person, could possibly be able to have more of a personalized path for the learner, so that the outcomes would be where they learn better, they retain what they've learned better. Would that be a fair assessment of using blended learning?
Yeah, I think what happens, the best way to capitalize on that is the real-time application, because I always involve real-time application in any of my learning, even before blended learning. Like, the only way you're going to learn this is by practicing it now. I always hate when instructors say, how will you apply this when you go back to work? Well, let's try it now. We're at work. Let's do it now. And so the personalized piece is all these people going back to their singular business units and applying what they're learning. So it is personalized in that way. And I always, one of our kind of talent strategic objectives was to engage managers and employees in more conversations. And that's been happening for a few years now. So I make that as part of my blended learning programs. Are always a part of that. So it's personalized with them as well.
I think that's a fantastic, sorry, Ann, I think that's a fantastic point, Rhonda, is the idea that now part of your learning experience, you're part of the structure that we build into that structured learning experience is actually on the job, which face-to-face cannot do. Well, face-to-face like this can do. But like being co-located in a classroom is not going to work for that kind of workplace application. And I remember back in my master's degree where we talked about the closer you can get the learning environment to the real job, the more traction you're going to get in the learning. Well, how much closer can it be than if they're learning on their actual job?
Yes, exactly.
And we can structure that right into our blend.
Yeah, exactly. No, Jay, that was exactly the point I was going to bring up. In the old school terminology, it was OJT, right, on the job training.
You can click on that.
Yeah, and you could, you sat in a classroom or whatever it was for a few hours, and then you learned everything you needed to know once you got on the job site from a supervisor or another employee who had been there longer and who was the trainer, who was the designated trainer. So that's a great point to bring up. I am going to pop up a question real quick from Duncan. I think this goes back to you, Jay, what you were saying earlier about time to competence. How does blended learning speed your time to competence?
Well, and that's a great question, Duncan. And I think one of the answers lies right in what Rhonda said earlier, is that you have them actually doing the stuff on the job. So we're not trying to make a simulation of what you're doing on the job. We're actually structuring that quote on the job training so that they're getting the most out of it. And I remember specifically, I've been talking to my staff about this, is, those of us who've been around for a while, if this is like point A where you're starting out, and this is point B where you're fully competent, you can imagine that the path that we took in our quote OJT looked a lot more like this getting to point B. Well, what we can do in our structured blended learning solutions is work with people who've been around the block a few times to see what that more straighter path is from A to B. And if we can structure that on-the-job training to be where we get from A to B in a much more direct path, our time to competence drops significantly.
Yep,
absolutely. So a linear path as opposed to the jagged path.
Yeah.
on the job application. So they get practice doing it all the time. And I think Jay had said in kind of his talking points earlier that it's not a one-time event, it's a process. So they do this a number of times, and that's going to help them get to productivity, competence sooner.
Oh, absolutely. Learning is a process. I mean, I think about myself and how I know how to use Excel, but if I don't use it often, there are things that I forget, and then I have to go back and do the go through the help, desk and whatever, right? The help clues. So back to the conversation about technology. I think you had brought it up a little bit, Rhonda, was the use of VR, virtual reality. I know in the oil field possibly, or in high consequence industries where, say, training on a rig is dangerous and probably costly. I know there are opportunities for using VR, but how do you get us there? How do you get these companies there? Is that part of a blended learning strategy that would be developed in the future to help speed up the time to competence, but also cut back on costs, but possibly cut back on people getting hurt or injured during training?
So that involved a lot of things you just said, Anne. I think of virtual learning and VR as two different things. So there's that. Okay. And then, yes, in our more technical problems, our more high impact, high cost problems, customer problems, then yes, we are using virtual reality, where we can have a technician here in Houston walk the person through it so they know exactly, they can look at the actual technology and go, do this, do that. So we do have those technologies that exist, and those are always shown at the OTC conference and things like that. Yeah, so that's really cool. I focus on mostly leader development with all of our corporate programs. And I have worked with them for about 16 years, this group, like this culture, this audience, NOV audience, and they would not respond well to some kind of virtual, if the whole thing was like that. There might be an instance where it's kind of a cool thing to do, but it's the human aspect of the going and applying it, talking to managers, talking to peers, having a facilitator kind of get it out of them, what they've uncovered, and reflect on that experience. And that's what really helps them grow. That I always say that, learning designers, learning professionals, they get distracted by technology sometimes. Yes. Oh, it's the cool new technology. Remember what you're trying to accomplish.
Yes, distracted by the shiny new thing.
Yeah.
Well, I want to piggyback on what you just said, because I think, of course, every time a new technology comes out, I mean, I'm pretty sure when the telephone came out, they think, hey, we could use that for training. They did that with video, and they did that with with computers. They think, hey, we could do that for training. So VR is definitely in that moving up that height curve for us. Everybody's getting excited about it, but doing a lot of things that may or may not actually encourage learning. One of the things that VR can do that it's really hard to do in a real world is actually assess and measure the minute behaviors that people are doing to understand how they're learning and what kind of things they still need to learn about. So, for example, when we're working with the VR solutions that we're building, number one, we're starting to build in the analysis behind it, where we can actually analyze the different things they do and link that to the learning objectives to see, okay, if they reach for the imaginary fire extinguisher or whatever, and they look at this fire extinguisher for a while before they choose the correct one, then we can determine maybe the problem is that they're struggling to understand which fire extinguisher that they need to use.
Or the fire extinguisher isn't displayed properly or whatever.
Exactly.
Make
so
it
we
red.
can measure that. And they're coming out with now in the new goggles that they're coming out for the virtual reality, they actually have built-in optical detection where they can look at exactly what you're looking at in that environment. So if you linger too much on one aspect before you move over to the right aspect, well, we can determine that maybe there's an issue there, where it's really hard to do that out in real world. In a virtual world, we can control and measure everything that goes on.
Right. And so then you're able to, as you mentioned, see, is it because the fire extinguisher is not placed in the right area or whatnot, and then go ahead and fix that before there is real harm done in a real world application when they're on the job, actually.
Exactly.
And so, yes, and that's a great way to use technology, not just because it's the cool thing, right? It actually solves a problem. Yes, it actually solves a problem. So back to earlier in the conversation where you were talking about thinking of constraints before you decided on a blended learning approach. I know, Rhonda, you'd mentioned you think about context versus content. So could you expound on that?
Yeah, that means my audience, basically. It means my learning audience. It means my business audience of the people that I'm working with. Participants are coming from a certain business audience. We have, part of our DNA, our identity is that we have acquired so many people along the path of NOV. I mean, NOV is an acronym of 3 different companies that joined back in 2006. So, and we've continued to do that. And honestly, that is part of our pride, that we honor that that singularity of that uniqueness of each business group. So I have to take that into account when I'm working with kind of each group and even each team to that level, that where they want to send people to a certain thing. To a certain, intervention of some sort. So context is key. And that's the other piece of context that I really bite into, is the on the job application. So that they're applying in their context of what they're doing. I have one program, it's a innovation program, and they have to develop a business case for an innovation within their group. So you talk about context, they are very different from one person to another. Like one person might be developing something for alternative energy in the middle of the ocean, and someone else is developing some kind of new string on a pipe. It's very, very different. Or we have people in HR or technology or whatever it is. Some people are developing a process. Some people are dividing or creating a new business model. So it's all about their context. And the content, like the 70-20-10 model, is only 10%. That's just kind of a jumping off point. Not have to go apply it to your real place. It's just like driving. You don't know the content until you do the content.
Yeah. No, that's a great analogy. You're right. You can sit in the classroom and learn how to drive, but you won't really know how to drive until you're actually in the car with the instructor next to you, hitting on his brakes. Jay, would you like to share any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was wondering if now is the right time to share the handout that I.
Yeah, I'm happy to bring it up.
So I'm hoping you guys can read this. We actually developed this not necessarily as a presentation, more as a handout for class. But when you look at this, it's the kind of thing that one needs to consider when one has to decide what kind of solutions that you're looking for a blended learning solution. And a lot of them are continuum, right? So for example, sometimes you have to think about whether you want to be synchronous or asynchronous or some combination of the two. You have to think about whether you want face-to-face or remote, whether you want classroom versus work-based, where classroom might have the opportunity to be more safe and controlled, like a laboratory environment, where work-based is more realistic and experiential. So some combination of those is helpful. Whether you want the learning to be facilitated or independent, and it's best to have a combination of both, because independent might allow more of that them choosing their own path, as Rhonda was bringing up, whereas facilitated is obviously gives more guidance and more a different kind of energy. Whether you want the learning to be more collaborative versus personal, one of the fantastic things about blended learning is it gives an opportunity to, whereas in like a face-to-face, you can't really necessarily see what each individual is doing, but in blended, you have fantastic opportunities to assess people individually and let them do their own personal learning. Whether you want it to be passive versus active. So is it going to be something that you have some kind of interaction, or is it going to be more like a video where they just take in the information? There's advantages to both. And then there's other things like whether we have it based on the business objectives or learner based. Sometimes we have to make trade-offs on that, but we want the best of both. And then there's also whether it's, and I apologize for this being so hard to read on the screen. But
we'll make sure that I get a JPEG of it. We'll share it.
Okay. The instructor feed content versus learner created content. I mean, sometimes it's really helpful to have learners create content, but then you also have the challenge of them getting it wrong. And then whether you want to do it for central versus locally facilitated or structured versus free form. All of these are different things that you have to consider when you're going through this to make sure that you're getting the right blend of instructional strategies that we're going for here.
So all these different considerations, as you mentioned. So let's talk about the synchronous and asynchronous approaches, Jay. What's there to consider between those two approaches, and what are the benefits, the pros and cons of each?
I mean, there's lots of things to think about on that, of course, but synchronous really allows you to get together and work a lot more collaboratively. Of course, the challenge on that is it does get in the way of that sort of more flexible, choose your own path, learner-centered kind of thing where people can work it in around their schedule. I'm sure most of the people on this call probably have had the experience where you try to do some kind of global learning event, and so you have to figure out how to sync up time zones between the US and Europe and Asia. And so someone's staying up until 9 and someone else is getting up at 6, and then someone gets to do it at noon or whatever. So it's tricky to do async or to do synchronous learning in that, but then if you do it asynchronously, you don't get this kind of energy that we're creating here, where, like Rhonda said, we are face to face, even though this is not necessarily in the classroom together. It's synchronous and it has that different kind of energy than people working on their own. And that's probably one of many. I'd like to hear what Rhonda has to say about that.
Sure. Could I share one of my?
Absolutely.
So I think, Jay, you probably get the opportunity to apply a lot more different contexts than I do. I'm mostly focused on manager, leader development, that type of thing. So, and we did a learning needs assessment for our group a number of years ago. And that's when we kind of honed in and said, okay, strategically, we're going after our leaders and managers because they have the biggest impact on our employees. So that's really where I focus rather than technical training and those types of things. But this is basically the cycle that we kind of follow in our blended programs. This one is called Making Your Case. It's that business case development innovation program. And the way we do synchronous is we have facilitator guidance by supplying a syllabus, which I can show you. This syllabus, which walks people through kind of weekly tasks. This program is an 8-week program, and it goes week by week where they have kind of learn, practice, reflect steps that they do. So that's kind of the facilitator guidance at one point. It gives people, what tasks am I working on now, when is it due by? And then the self-study topics, which is asynchronous, they're directed toward a certain topic for the week, and they are directed towards certain content. At the very end of the program, they're allowed to do their own because we want to dig up what they're curious about, and maybe that will be added on to the program at the end. Maybe not this program, but there's another one. And then they do practice this where they're actually applying it in their business. And it follows this cycle every single week of the 8 weeks or 16 weeks or whatever it is. And during that, we also include social learning. And this is the face-to-face portion. We found out in our learning needs assessment that that was a piece that was missed. I mean, we already knew this instinctively, right? From instructor-led, that's the biggest piece that people miss, is learning from each other. So we still do that. Even before COVID, we always had a virtual option for those joining remotely. And we try to do it by region so we don't have time zone differences. I'm delivering to North America and Latin America. So we're all basically the same. And then I train trainers across the world who deliver in their regions. So we don't have that discomfort for anyone. And then there's a reflection piece, and that's where they work with their manager. They have a framework, a guided framework that they follow each week, and they get advice and they develop deeper relationships with their managers, which is great. And then that's for this program, we also have internal expert speakers on whatever topic we're talking about. So those have been really, really beneficial. And we've seen really good results from this as well. But that's how we include synchronous and asynchronous.
Okay.
That's
So
great.
it's still actively facilitated, but there is
Only the peer discussion is actively facilitated. The other component that's facilitated is we give them a syllabus for the entire program. And then it's really up to them to, follow it week by week. Well, of course, we're encouraging, and I have an additional facilitator who helps me, like, getting back to them and things. But the people in our business, there's so many engineers and just process-minded people. They love the syllabus. They love that kind of structure. Yes, I know what to do.
yes.
So it's been beneficial.
So it's self-directed, but with structure.
With structure. Yes, I think it's important to have an infrastructure so people know what to do, but it also to include a human element, like Jay has been saying, in that infrastructure. So that you're not sending them off to do click, click, click training on e-learning somewhere.
And having that coach in the background, even though it's not like synchronously facilitated, having that coach in the background who does kind of check in with the learners every now and then. I mean, all of us have been on diets before, and we all have great intentions to reach those goals. And we always, well, at least me, always fall off without having somebody in the background push us through to get through the things that we're talking about. And I think that even having a structured, self-paced thing, you can still have that facilitator, like you were saying, Rhonda, in the background, just checking in, making sure that they're doing the stuff, that they're meeting their goals, giving some
coaching. That's what we do during the peer discussions. So they're not only learning from us, they're learning from peers, and they're getting that experience still. And they learn that, oh, wow, that guy has the same challenges as in a different part of the business. How did you solve the problem? Well, I'm going to try that. And so they learn just as much from each other than they do from a facilitator, because we do not instruct. We facilitate conversation.
And I think
Go ahead.
that's the key. Well, no, I just wanted, because I love what you said there. So, like, we're not here to instruct. I think the blended learning facilitator is a whole different skill set than the types of facilitators that back in traditional training. Because number one, you're there to facilitate, not necessarily instruct. But two, you're in a whole different environment. You're not standing in front of a classroom with a microphone on or whatever and a whiteboard and clicking through your PowerPoint. You're out engaging people in potentially virtual asynchronous situations, still helping them to move down that path to get to those learning solutions. And that takes a level of magnitude difference in the kind of skills we need in our facilitators.
It takes a lot more listening than speaking.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is facilitation and active facilitation isn't really necessarily the way we thought of it in the traditional sense, where you've got someone who's facilitating the class, who's teaching it, it's more of someone who is there to guide and listen, so that can make sure that you are following the learning path, or if you come across any hurdles or challenges, that's what the facilitator's role really should be.
And maybe even nag a little bit.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, to provoke a little.
Accountable, right?
Provoke. Especially the higher up you go, like this program, the Making Your Case program, is higher level people. And I'm having them bring in a business case. So I provoke them from the beginning. I challenge them to think a little bit differently and deeper, because they might come in with some kind of solution on day one. I'm like, wait a minute, you haven't even told me the pain of the customer. How can you have the solution already? And
Right.
so I will poke and poke and poke, and by golly, by the end, they understand the process. They can do the due diligence, and they're proud of it.
Yes. So even with the technologies available to help us, there's still that human component, as both of you have repeatedly brought up. There is still the human component that's needed, in this case, the facilitator, or the face-to-face discussions, or the peer feedback. And so that's all part of a blended learning strategy. It's not just simply, okay, here's syllabus, here's what you have to read, and let's talk about it at the end of the week.
Yeah, it's not grad school.
Right. It's a process, as you mentioned, but it's an evolving process, and it continues. It's a path.
Well, and I think about when you call in to a helpline, and you get the press 1 for customer service, press 2 for, and you keep going through that, and all you want to do is get to a human. Well, we need to build our blended learning solutions that way, where there's always that human element. Yes, we can use technology to build in some of that learning and make it automated, because people can guide themselves through that. But if they ever get to that same experience that we get when we're on those helplines, and we're like just trying to get through to a human because the helpline doesn't have a press 7 for whatever you need them to do, I mean, we don't want our learning to be that way. So having a facilitator in the background, making sure that all this stuff is happening and taking good care of our learners is huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
A very great point. So we brought up business outcomes a couple of times, and you start your planning there, right? Knowing what the business goals and business outcomes should be. So let's talk a little further about that, dive into business outcomes. And if you've got some use cases that you're able to share with us, that would be great.
Sure. Did you want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. Well, yeah, sure. We can start with this if you want to help share that screen. In 2017, I was listening to an earnings call, and our CEO said at the end of the call to all employees, everyone must innovate, because he was talking about the innovation going on in the company, and that it happens every single place. So of course, from my little learning designer head, I thought, well, how? Because he's saying everyone, not just business leaders who are typically my audience, everyone must innovate. And I thought they don't necessarily have the skills to do that. And so that's what kind of led me down. I need to, find some kind of intervention that will help them actually practice innovation and get results in their business. And so that's when we created the Making Your Case blended solution. And some of the results, one thing that we say, it's innovation. And innovation, one of the results that we tell them, one of the ways you can succeed in the program is to grow a new idea. But one way to succeed is also to kill an idea, because it's better to find out in 8 weeks if it's viable rather than 8 years, which happens all the time.
Yeah.
And so that's one place where they focus. What comes out of it, though, are actual results that happen with business groups. And so these are some examples. I have testimonials, but they're too small to see. So these are actually things that have happened in the business. All of these, tangibles kind of on top and intangibles on the bottom. And really, I was going for the intangibles. I have learned from my leaders over the years. I used to do a sales leadership program where we had significant generated, new revenue and ROI. And it just, in the end, it didn't really matter. They're kind of a story group. I don't know. They like to see it anecdotally, or to feel it, just feel the results. And they want to see it from their people. And so it's just kind of been an interesting learning moment for me. So I wasn't necessarily going for ROI, because honestly, HMM is our main online provider platform. Mm-hmm. And it's a sunk cost. So this is delivered at zero cost to the business, which used to not be the case.
Oh, wow.
right? Because of all the travel, materials, development time, all of that. So I always advertise to them, this is delivered at zero cost to you. There's, you know, you don't have to worry about any of those things. So I'm sure the ROI would be significant, but I'm not wasting my time measuring that anymore. They want to see these things. What are the real business results for each group? And these are participants and managers that have reported these benefits. So it's not just a kind of a perception survey, which has been nice. So we have helped them actually innovate different things in their jobs, which was the actual thing we were trying to accomplish.
There you go. You accomplished your goal. So back to your point, what you were saying, yes, cost is important, something to consider, but then typically it's, you know, the accounting or the CFO who's looking at these things. But at the end of the day, you've got to have a group of employees and staff who are efficient in what they're doing, you know, efficient in their processes and their procedures, and knows their job well and retains what they've learned. And I think that's a great way to think about it, as opposed to just dollars and cents.
Yeah, for sure.
Jay, what would you add to that?
Well, I like what Rhonda said about the stories, because one of the things that I talk to my people about is the idea that results don't matter if they can't turn into stories and people can't tell stories about them.
Yeah.
If you think about, we talk about business results as if it's like this tangible set thing that people all know what that is. But the reality is all business results is what people care about.
Right.
And people want to tell stories about what they care about. Otherwise, it might as well not have even happened. So when we look at the kind of business results, and obviously you need business results that help the business to survive and to grow. But even then, if it doesn't turn into a story, no one cares. So we look at how do we not only define the right business results and measure them, but then how do we turn that into the kind of story that people are going to get excited about continuing to tell? And that's what business results ends up meaning.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. I think one strategy I've used to help encourage those kinds of stories in the business, so it doesn't just stay in one place, because traditionally, like if we have some program where they're going to present a business case or whatever, they're going to do it to a group of instructors and to maybe the higher leaders, right? They don't do that with this program. They deliver it for real. So they're asking their business leaders in their business groups, do I have your permission for this kind of resource to move forward on this case?
That's awesome.
So it's a real thing that's done in different pockets of the business, all over the business. And those are the stories that are emerging. I think sometimes we get caught up in kind of the attention of let's have all these business leaders come in, or let me instruct them on how to do this right. And that's just not what it's about.
And that's great, going back to what we're talking about, blended learning, because traditionally when we do that in a classroom, then you'd have to have the logistics of getting on the schedules of these leaders to come in and sit in this class, and you put a little table and they all sit it there, and they
like judges.
And they're probably, while they're listening to all these presentations, they're probably thinking, I really got to get back to my other work. and we think it works so great. And I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't work. It probably works, but think about the idea of, instead of presenting to that fake panel in the back who really may or may not care much about what they're talking about, they go and present the actual idea to a real business leader with real live results. And that only happens in blended learning.
Yeah, exactly.
I love what you both have said about using these stories and anecdotals from a marketing standpoint. As a marketer, that's how
stories sell.
Stories sell, exactly. And it's a great way to have a story and have a use case show that this is how we have successfully met business outcomes, or these are the business results that we focused on and have met those results, have helped them to meet those results. But it just, and everything that we have conversed about today or discussed today, it just still goes back to fundamentals, right? It's still, blended learning is this quote unquote buzzword, but there's still the fundamentals of learning to be applied in this process, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Any closing thoughts over this that you would like to share with our audience?
I think exactly what you're saying, stick to the foundation. You must still have some type of learning plan. What's the design of it? And then anything that you're trying to accomplish, you start there. What are you trying to accomplish? What's the objective? And start there. And then if all of these other technological components, face-to-face components, whatever, if they make sense to help you accomplish that, add them in. But that does not come first. And professionals sometimes get confused and start with delivery models instead of what are we trying to help people learn?
Yes.
Yeah, so people get kind of hung up on that, the delivery model, like, oh, should it be ILT? Should it be e-learning? Should it be, but you're right, you should focus on what you want as a result and the outcomes.
Right.
Jay, you were about to share your thoughts.
Well, first, I was kind of hoping to see more live comments and questions. I appreciate, Duncan, you're jumping in and adding the comments and questions. So I'm hoping that if you guys out there are having questions, that you get to opportunity to put that in those comments. I would say we talked at the beginning of this about how learning is a process, and the reality is that process is going on without you. And how arrogant our profession was in its early days, back when we thought we were the thing that caused learning. Right. And that the learning started when they showed up in our classroom and ended when they left.
Right.
We need to be thinking about the fact that our people are learning all the time, and our best thing that we can do as instructional designers, sorry about my dogs, the best thing that we can do as instructional designers is sync up with and help structure that learning experience so that they get there more quickly. So instead of them already going through that learning process where it's zigzagging, we can offer the guidance to get them there on a straighter line. That's what we're doing. We're not causing the learning. We're working and facilitating the learning.
No, that's a great thought to end with, is that you're facilitating this learning, because folks learn all the time. It's just a matter of helping guide that learning, and regardless of the strategy or the process, that's what you're there to do. And I think Duncan has he focus on the learner was his
yeah.
split. So, and Jay, to your point, we typically have more viewers after the fact, and so we'll most likely have some comments and whatnot after when people catch the replay. So we'll get some more input. But this has been a great conversation today.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. It's helped me to understand blended learning a little bit better, and hopefully our viewers will too, and understand that while it is a great this buzzword, I keep calling it a buzzword, but because everybody's been talking about blended learning so much, it still goes back to the fundamentals of learning. And so thank you to you both. We will make sure that I include the how to connect with both Rhonda and Jay, both on LinkedIn. Both of you are on LinkedIn. I know Jay is active on Twitter as well, and we'll include your the way for people to connect with you via LinkedIn, and in case anyone has any questions or anything afterwards. But again, I appreciate both of you being on here today and taking the time out of your day to participate and have this great discussion with us.
Absolutely.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for including me. And this.
Great talking to you, Jay. Nice.
Right. I really enjoyed switching to this format where we have this face-to-face interaction, and so exactly, I'm going to remember that, Rhonda, for sure. Thank you for everyone who's tuned in today live, and then if you're watching the replay, please feel free to continue to put your comments and questions in the replies, and we'll make sure that we forward it on to Rhonda or Jay, respectively, or both of them. And then next week on Learning Collective, please tune in. We're going to have Brian Dusablon and Jane Bozarth on discussing accessibility. So that should be a very, very interesting topic as well. So thank you, everyone. Take care and have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ann.